Bryan Kohberger was sentenced for consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole on July 23, 2025, for the brutal stabbing murders of University of Idaho students in November 2022. Judge Stephen Hippler delivered the sentence at the Ada County Courthouse in Boise, Idaho, after Kohberger pleaded guilty to killing Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Goncalves, and Madison Mogen in their off-campus rental home. The 30-year-old former criminology graduate student also received an additional 10 years for burglary charges and was ordered to pay $270,000 in fines and civil penalties, with reports indicating that Kaylee Goncalves was stabbed 34 times and that significant force was used by the perpetrator. The murder weapon was determined to be consistent with a carbine knife that Kohberger had purchased on Amazon. Police were able to connect him to the crime through DNA evidence found on the knife sheath, which bore Marine Corps insignia and was discovered on the bed next to one of the victims, where he will remain until he dies. The case, which captivated national attention and brought intense scrutiny to the small college town of Moscow, Idaho, has finally reached its legal conclusion. Though the emotional and psychological wounds inflicted on the victims' families and the surviving roommates will undoubtedly persist for years to come, this evidence ultimately led to his arrest in Pennsylvania and subsequent extradition to Idaho. The sentencing hearing was marked by powerful and emotional victim impact statements from the families of all four victims, who described their profound anguish and loss. One of the most troubling aspects of this case remains the complete mystery surrounding Kohberger's motive. Law enforcement officials have stated that they believe he had a specific reason for committing the murders, but they have been unable to determine what drove him to kill four students, with whom he apparently had no prior connection. This lack of understanding about his motivations continues to haunt the families and the broader community, leaving fundamental questions about the nature of these crimes unanswered. Steve Goncalves, father of victim Kaylee Goncalves, directly confronted Kohberger about his carelessness in leaving behind DNA evidence. She delivered a powerful statement about her trauma and resilience, telling the court, "He may have shattered parts of me, but I'm still putting myself back together." The content now flows in continuous paragraphs rather than using bullet points or lists, while maintaining all the key details about his four consecutive life sentences. The emotional victim impact statements and the ongoing mysteries surrounding his motives for these brutal murders, piece by piece, and defiantly declaring, "He will never get to take my voice." Her testimony provided insight into the lasting impact on those who survived that horrific night and witnessed the aftermath of Kohberger's crimes, telling him, "You were that careless, that foolish, that stupid." Master's degree, declining to speak when given the opportunity and showing no visible reaction when his sentence was read. He appeared in an orange jail jumpsuit and remained shackled during the hearing. His plea agreement, which spared him from the death penalty, came after months of legal proceedings and mounting evidence against him, including DNA found on a knife sheath left at the crime scene. "You're a joke." Scott Laramie, stepfather of Madison Mogen, spoke of the extraordinary life they had lived because of Madison, saying this world was a better place with her in it. The family's statements painted vivid pictures of the vibrant young lives that were cut short and the devastating impact on those left behind. In a particularly significant moment, Dylan Mortensen, one of the surviving roommates, spoke publicly for the first time since the murders occurred. Kohberger himself remained largely silent throughout the proceedings. The investigation revealed the brutal nature of the attacks, despite the conviction and sentencing. Kohberger will now spend the remainder of his natural life at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho. I've rewritten the information about Bryan Kohberger's sentencing in paragraph format as requested. The question of why Bryan Kohberger committed these brutal murders continues to haunt investigators. families, and the public even after his sentencing to life in prison. Despite an extensive investigation that led to his conviction, law enforcement officials have been unable to determine a clear motive for the killings, leaving one of the most fundamental questions about this case unanswered. During Kohberger's sentencing hearing on July 23, 2025, Judge Stephen Hippler acknowledged that the motive may never be known. Who may have chosen the house and victims randomly as part of an attempt to emulate notorious serial killers like Ted Bundy? This theory is particularly compelling given Kohberger's background as a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, where he was pursuing his PhD in criminology. According to police reports released after his sentencing, Latah County prosecutor Bill Thompson revealed that Kohberger deep-cleaned his vehicle following the crime, suggesting he was aware of the types of evidence that could link him to the scene. Despite these efforts, investigators were able to connect him to the murders through DNA evidence found on a knife sheath left at the crime scene. The content now flows in continuous paragraphs while covering the key points. The official acknowledgement that his motive remains unknown. The two leading theories, obsessive stalking versus thrill killing, insights from those who knew him, and a lasting mystery that continues to haunt the victims' families, along with cell phone records and surveillance footage that placed him in the area. The fact that Kohberger, with his criminology background, still left behind crucial evidence has led some to speculate about his mental state at the time of the murders. Some experts wonder whether the crimes were more impulsive than initially thought, or whether Kohberger's academic knowledge of criminal investigations was insufficient to help him avoid the sophisticated forensic techniques that ultimately led to his capture. A fellow teaching assistant who considered Kohberger a friend described him as very intelligent but also selfish. This colleague noted that Kohberger would often mislead him, involved from the victim's family seeking understanding to investigators who solved the case, but cannot explain why it happened. Judge Hippler's observation that seeking explanations for the unexplainable only gives more power to the perpetrator reflects a broader challenge in criminal justice. Sometimes the most important question, why, simply cannot be answered satisfactorily. The case serves as a stark reminder that even when justice is served and a killer is brought to account for their crimes, the fundamental human need to understand motivation and meaning may remain unfulfilled. For the families of Madison, Xana, Kaylee, and Ethan, Kohberger's silence means they must find a way to move forward without ever knowing why their loved ones were targeted, leaving them to grapple with a loss that is not only devastating, but also inexplicable, adding another layer of trauma to an already unimaginable tragedy. When it came to their shared work and would have him complete work meant for Kohberger, suggesting a pattern of manipulative behavior and a willingness to exploit others for his own benefit. These character insights, while limited, paint a picture of someone who was academically capable, but potentially lacking in empathy and willing to use others. However, these traits alone do not explain the leap from academic misconduct to brutal murder, leaving a significant gap in understanding how someone could progress from being a difficult colleague to becoming a killer of innocent students, where he would have studied criminal behavior and famous murder cases extensively. Some experts suggest that his academic focus on criminology may have provided him with both the knowledge of how to commit crimes, while attempting to avoid detection, and a fascination with infamous killers that could have motivated him to try to achieve similar notoriety. This theory would explain the seemingly random nature of the attack and the lack of any personal connection between Kohberger and his victims, suggesting that the murders were committed purely for the psychological satisfaction of killing rather than for any specific grievance against the individuals involved, stating there was no reason for these crimes that could approach anything resembling rationality. The judge emphasized that no conceivable reason could make any sense and suggested that continuing to search for explanations only gives more power and control to Kohberger himself. Police investigators have confirmed they found no prior connection between Kohberger and any of the four victims, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Goncalves, and Ethan Chapin, and no evidence that he was following their social media accounts or had any relationship with them whatsoever. When given the opportunity to speak at his sentencing hearing and potentially provide some explanation for his actions, Kohberger declined to address the court, telling the judge he respectfully chose not to speak. This silence has left the victims' families without the closure they desperately sought, forcing them to grapple with the senseless nature of their loved ones' deaths, without any understanding of what drove their killer to act. The absence of any explanation from Kohberger himself has compounded the tragedy for the families, who must now live with not only the devastating loss of their children, but also the torment of never knowing why they were targeted. While no official motive has been established, two primary theories have emerged among investigators and crime analysts who have studied the case extensively. The first theory suggests that Kohberger was an obsessive individual who had been stalking his victims for an extended period before the attack. This theory is supported by cell phone location data that showed Kohberger had been in the neighborhood around the victim's home multiple times before the murders occurred. The repeated visits to the area suggest a level of premeditation and surveillance that could indicate he had been watching the house and its occupants. Though investigators have found no evidence of direct contact or interaction between Kohberger and any of the victims, this pattern of behavior would be consistent with someone who had developed an unhealthy fixation on the residents of the house, possibly observing their routines and planning his attack over time. The second theory positions Kohberger as a thrill killer. The limited information available about Kohberger's personality and behavior comes from his academic colleagues at Washington State University. What investigators do know is that Kohberger appeared to use his knowledge of forensic investigations in an attempt to cover his tracks after the murders. The absence of a clear motive in the Kohberger case represents one of the most frustrating aspects for everyone. I've rewritten the information about Bryan Kohberger's unknown motives in paragraph format as requested. Bryan Kohberger's public statements throughout his legal proceedings were remarkably sparse, characterized by an almost complete refusal to provide any meaningful explanation for his actions or show remorse for the devastating crimes he committed. During his guilty plea hearing on July 2nd, 2025, Kohberger was given the opportunity for allocution, the legal right to speak before sentencing, which could have provided him with a platform to explain his actions. Delivering a scathing rebuke during the sentencing, the judge called Kohberger a faceless coward and criticized him for his complete lack of remorse or recognition of the pain he had caused. Though the specific content of this brief statement was not detailed in the available information, this minimal verbal interaction represented the extent of Kohberger's communication during what should have been a moment for reflection. According to police reports released after his sentencing, when investigators attempted to interview Kohberger after his arrest in Pennsylvania, he initially engaged in surface-level conversation, but quickly shut down when they tried to delve into more detailed questions about the crimes. Moscow Police Corporal Brett Payne revealed that their strategy was to get him to speak and keep him speaking with surface-level topics that could approach anything resembling rationality. Took on additional weight in light of Kohberger's refusal to speak. The judge noted that even if they could somehow obtain truthful insight into the killings, it would not be satisfying because the crimes themselves were fundamentally irrational and senseless. This acknowledgement reflected the broader challenge posed by Kohberger's silence, that even if he had chosen to speak, his explanations might not have provided the closure and understanding that the families desperately sought. The judge concluded by stating that the time has now come to end Mr. Kohberger's 15 minutes of fame and that he should be consigned to the ignominy and isolation of perpetual incarceration, effectively dismissing any further opportunity for Kohberger to command attention or provide explanations for his actions. But when they attempted to explore the details of the case, he decided to end the interview. His communication was remarkably minimal, just a simple yes when pleading guilty, and a refusal to speak at sentencing despite being given the opportunity for allocution. This behavior demonstrated a calculated approach to communication, suggesting that Kohberger was aware enough to engage minimally when it served his interests. Even during police interviews, Kohberger shut down when they tried to get into details about the crimes. His silence has left the victims' families without the answers and closure they desperately sought, but was unwilling to provide any substantive information that might shed light on his motivations or the specifics of how he carried out the murders, highlighting his apparent complete lack of empathy. Is there anything specific about his statements or lack thereof that you'd like me to explore? Further explanation, or at least acknowledgement of the gravity of his actions, the brevity and apparent insignificance of this response, while family members delivered heart-wrenching statements about their loss, their ongoing pain, and their desperate need for answers. Kohberger sat impassively, offering no response, no acknowledgement, and no sign that their words had any impact on him whatsoever. This complete emotional disconnect reinforced the perception of Kohberger as someone fundamentally lacking in empathy and human connection, someone who could commit such brutal acts and then remain completely unmoved by the consequences of his actions. Further emphasized his complete disconnection from the emotional weight of the proceedings and his apparent indifference to the suffering of the victims' families who were present in the courtroom. Hippler stated that even in pleading guilty, he is given nothing hinting at remorse or redemption, nothing suggesting a recognition, an understanding, or even a regret for the pain that he has caused. The judge went on to say that he could not legally force Kohberger to explain why he had committed the murders, and expressed doubt that Kohberger would answer truthfully even if compelled to speak. This judicial condemnation highlighted the profound frustration felt by everyone involved in the case, from the family seeking answers to the legal system trying to understand the senseless nature of the crimes, express remorse, or offer some closure to the victims' families. However, he declined to make any statement to the court, telling the judge he respectfully chose not to speak. This decision to remain silent was particularly devastating for the families of the victims, who had hoped that the sentencing hearing might finally provide some answers about why their loved ones were targeted and killed. The opportunity for allocution represented perhaps the last chance for Kohberger to provide any insight into his motivations or to show some recognition of the pain he had caused. But he chose instead to maintain the same cold silence that had characterized his behavior throughout the legal proceedings. His most significant verbal response came when Judge Stephen Hippler asked him directly if he killed all four victims willingly, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice with forethought. Kohberger's response was a simple, emotionless yes, confirming his guilt in the brutal murders of Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Goncalves, and Ethan Chapin. This single-word admission represented one of the few times throughout the entire legal process that Kohberger actually spoke about his crimes, and even then, it was merely a factual acknowledgement, rather than any attempted explanation or expression of remorse. At his sentencing hearing on July 23, 2025, Judge Stephen Hippler expressed his frustration and disgust with Kohberger's refusal to speak or show any remorse during the sentencing hearing. There was mention of Kohberger issuing what was described as a three-word response. The pattern of Kohberger's minimal verbal responses extended beyond the courtroom to his interactions with law enforcement during the investigation. The stark contrast between Kohberger's silence and the emotional outpouring from the victims' families during the sentencing hearing created a particularly jarring dynamic in the courtroom. Judge Hippler's observation that there was no reason for these crimes RV provided a comprehensive overview of Bryan Kohberger's statements or lack thereof throughout his legal proceedings in paragraph format. Judge Hippler called him a faceless coward for showing no remorse and criticized his complete silence. The most striking aspect is how his minimal responses contrasted sharply with the emotional victim impact statements. Bryan Kohberger's family background reveals a Pennsylvania-based family who maintained their support for him throughout the lengthy legal proceedings. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, his mother, Bryan Kohberger, and his sister Amanda were present at his July 23rd. Bryan Kohberger was observed quietly weeping at times, particularly when Madison Mogen's grandmother expressed sympathy not only for the victims' families, but also for the Kohberger family. This moment of compassion from one of the victims' family members toward Kohberger's mother highlighted the complex web of grief and pain as DNA evidence from their Pennsylvania residence played a crucial role in linking Bryan to the murders. Law enforcement found evidence at the Kohberger family home which including information that would have been observable to his family members. According to the documents, Kohberger maintained unusual sleep patterns during this time, staying awake most nights and only napping during the day. Perhaps most significantly, he would video chat with his mother for hours each day, create ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate victims and their families. While nothing can compare to the loss experienced by the families of Madison Mogen, his mother Marianne and sister Amanda attended his sentencing, showing quiet support despite the horrific nature of his crimes. Particularly telling was how Bryan completely ignored them as he left the courtroom, demonstrating the same lack of empathy that likely enabled him to commit the murders. Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Goncalves, and Ethan Chapin. The Kohberger family has also had to endure the public shame, emotional trauma, and police reports revealed he video chatted with his mother for hours daily around the time of the murders. Their situation highlights how violent crimes create ripple effects that extend beyond just the immediate victims to include the perpetrator's family as well. And devastating realization that someone they loved was capable of such brutality. Their story illustrates the complex and painful reality that families of perpetrators must face when someone they care about commits unthinkable acts, leaving them to grapple with grief, guilt, and the challenge of reconciling their love for a family member with the horror of his crimes, suggesting a close relationship that makes his later dismissal of her at the sentencing even more jarring. These extended conversations with his mother occurred during the same period when he was allegedly planning and carrying out the murders, raising questions about whether his family noticed any changes in his behavior or demeanor that might have indicated something was wrong when analyzed by labs in Idaho, showed a strong familial relation to the DNA found on the knife sheath at the crime scene, though they have largely remained out of the public eye throughout the case, choosing to maintain their privacy while dealing with the unimaginable situation of having a family member commit such heinous crimes. Their decision to stay largely silent publicly, while still showing up to support Bryan in court, reflects the impossible position they found themselves in, loving a family member while being horrified by his actions. The family's quiet presence at key court hearings demonstrated their commitment to Bryan as a person, even as they undoubtedly struggled with the knowledge of what he had done for innocent young Opal and their families. The genetic analysis revealed that 99.9998% of the male population would be excluded from being the suspect's biological father, effectively confirming that the DNA belonged to someone from the Kohberger family line. This evidence became one of the key pieces that led to Bryan's arrest and eventual conviction, meaning that his own family's genetic material became instrumental in proving his guilt. That extended beyond just the immediate victims to include the families of both the murdered students and the perpetrator himself. The sight of Bryan Kohberger sobbing in the courtroom served as a stark reminder that Bryan's actions had created multiple layers of tragedy, affecting not only those who lost loved ones, but also his own family members who had to grapple with the reality of what their son and brother had become. 2025 sentencing hearing. Sitting quietly behind him in the courtroom as the only family members in attendance, alongside his defense attorneys, his father, who had been present at the earlier guilty plea hearing in July 2025, notably did not attend the sentencing. The family's presence at these proceedings demonstrated their continued support for Bryan, even as they faced the devastating reality of what he had done for innocent young people. During the emotional victim impact statements at the sentencing hearing, in a particularly cold and telling moment that revealed much about Bryan Kohberger's character, he completely ignored his mother and sister as he exited the courtroom after sentencing, showing no acknowledgement of their presence or the emotional support they had provided. By attending the hearing, this callous behavior toward his own family members, who had stood by him throughout the legal process, demonstrated the same lack of empathy and human connection that likely contributed to his ability to commit such brutal murders. The fact that he could dismiss his own mother and sister so completely, after they had endured the public shame and emotional trauma of supporting him through this ordeal, speaks to a profound disconnect from normal human emotions and relationships. The Kohberger family's involvement in the case extended beyond mere courtroom appearances. Police reports released after the sentencing revealed disturbing details about Bryan's behavior in the period around the murders. The Kohberger family released a statement ahead of the court proceedings. The impact on the Kohberger family serves as a reminder that violent crimes. I've provided information about Bryan Kohberger's parents and family in paragraph format. The family's DNA actually helped convict him.